The envelope landed on the gravel at 4:47 in the morning. Dex Holloway heard it slide through the mail slot, heard it skip across the concrete floor of the garage, and he knew, the way a man who has been waiting for a verdict for 11 months always knows, that this was the one. He didn't move right away. He sat on the old shop stool beside his 1978 Harley-Davidson Shovelhead, the one they called Resurrection, and he pressed his palms flat against the cold chrome of the gas tank. The envelope was white. The return address said Commonwealth of Virginia. And it had his name on it, Dexter Ray Holloway, printed in that clean government font that never tells you anything about whether the news inside is going to set you free or bury you where you stand. He left it there for 6 minutes. This is the story of what happened when he finally picked it up. And what it cost him to get to the moment when he could. There is a particular kind of man who lives at the edge of everything, not by rebellion, not by pride, but because the middle ground was taken from him before he understood what it meant to fight for it. Dex Holloway was 61 years old, lean as a fence post, with hands that had rebuilt more engines than he could count and a face that had weathered 2 tours in Vietnam, 30 years of highway sun, and one very specific, very targeted lie that had dismantled everything he had built since he came home. He wasn't a man who talked about himself much. He talked to bikes. He talked to the highway when it was empty. He talked, very occasionally, to his dog, a 3-legged shepherd named Corporal, who slept beneath the shovelhead and growled at the mail carrier every single morning without prejudice. But that morning, Dex didn't talk to anyone. He sat in his garage in Harrisonburg, Virginia, a small cinderblock garage with a single fluorescent bulb that buzzed and flickered when the temperature dropped, and he looked at that envelope, and something behind his sternum pulled tight like a cable under load. 11 months earlier, a man named Gerald Breed had walked into the Rockingham County Sheriff's Office and told a deputy that Dex Holloway had stolen a motorcycle. A 1969 Triumph Bonneville T120, candy apple red, belonging to the Breed family estate. Curtis had said he had paperwork. Curtis had said there were witnesses. Curtis had said Dex had taken it from a storage unit on Route 33 while the family was settling the will of Curtis's deceased father, Gerald Breed, a man who, as it happened, had been Dex's closest friend for 27 years. The arrest had been quiet. The arraignment had been quieter. And the 11 months between that day and this envelope had been the loudest silence Dex Holloway had ever sat inside. The fluorescent bulb buzzed. Corporal shifted under the shovelhead, his 3 legs finding a new angle. Dex picked up the envelope. He had met Gerald Breed in 1976 at a rest stop on Interstate 81, somewhere south of Staunton, in a rain so heavy the road had turned to gray glass. Gerald's shovel-nosed 74 FLH had thrown a chain, and Dex, 23 years old, 3 months back from Southeast Asia, riding a borrowed Sportster toward no particular destination, had pulled over without being asked. They spent 2 hours in the rain fixing a chain by the light of a single emergency flare, and by the time the Harley was rolling again, Gerald had called him brother, and Dex had understood, for the first time since coming home, that the word meant something. They rode together for decades. Through West Virginia's river curves and the long straight burns across Tennessee, through the Smoky Mountains in October when the maples went red, through the cold gray dunes of the Outer Banks in January when no tourists were left and the wind came off the Atlantic like a hand pressed flat against your chest. They were charter members of the Iron Covenant, a small independent club out of Harrisonburg with no colors worth fearing and no politics worth explaining, just 14 men who believed a man's word and a man's throttle hand were the same thing. Either you had both or you had neither. Gerald had been sick for 2 years before he died. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate. He had given Dex the Triumph Bonneville himself, not in a will, not through an attorney, but in the way Gerald did everything that mattered to him, in person, on a Sunday, with coffee going cold on the workbench and grease on both their hands. He had handed Dex the title, signed and notarized, in February of the year before he passed. "She's yours now," Gerald had said. "I need to know she'll be ridden." Dex had kept the title in a fireproof lockbox bolted to the floor of his garage. He had the notarized bill of sale. He had two witnesses who had been in that garage on that February Sunday, Ray Tipton and a man everyone called Soot, whose legal name was Bernard Garza. Both of them members of the Iron Covenant. Both of them ready to stand up in court. The problem was that Curtis Breed, Gerald's only surviving son, a man who had not visited his father in the last 18 months of his life, a man who smelled of cologne and grievance in equal measure, had produced his own paperwork. A different title. A different notarization date. A story about the Triumph being stored on Gerald's behalf, temporarily, at Dex's garage, pending estate resolution. 2 sets of paperwork. 1 motorcycle. And a county prosecutor who had looked at both, looked at Dex, a 61-year-old biker with no college degree and a face that had been broken twice, and decided that the man with the lawyer was probably telling the truth. The bail had been set and paid. The Triumph had been impounded. And Dex had been told not to leave the state of Virginia. That was 11 months ago. The envelope was thin. He had been in enough bureaucratic processes to know that thin wasn't good. Thin meant form letter. Thin meant a decision rendered from a distance by someone who had never sat at a gravel rest stop at 2 in the morning and fixed a man's bike in the rain. He opened it anyway. He read it standing up, which was the only way Dex Holloway read difficult things. His eyes moved once, quickly, across the lines. Then he set the paper down on the workbench, beside a half-disassembled carburetor and a tin cup of cold coffee, and he stood very still for a moment. The charges had been dropped. All of them. But the Triumph Bonneville, the specific, singular, irreplaceable motorcycle that Gerald Breed had pressed into his hands on that February Sunday, remained in a county impound lot in Rockingham County, listed as property under dispute, pending civil resolution. And the civil resolution, according to the letter, had been decided in favor of the Breed estate. In favor of Curtis. Dex set the letter down so carefully it didn't make a sound. Corporal came out from under the shovelhead and put his one front paw on Dex's boot. The fluorescent bulb buzzed. He had 72 hours to contest the civil ruling before the court's decision became permanent and the Triumph would be released to Curtis Breed's possession. 72 hours, and his public defender, a young woman named Paulette who had done the best she could with what she had already sent a message the night before saying she couldn't take the civil case, that it was outside her jurisdiction, that he would need a private attorney, and that a private attorney for a title dispute in Virginia would cost money that she had never asked Dex whether he had, because she already knew. He didn't have it. The Iron Covenant had 14 members, or had once. Time and distance had reduced that number. 4 were dead. 1 had moved to New Mexico and fallen out of contact. 2 had left the club quietly over the years for reasons that were never fully explained and were never pressed. That left 7, including Dex, and of those 7, the 2 who mattered most in this moment, Ray Tipton and Soot, lived in different states. Ray Tipton had relocated to Knoxville, Tennessee, 2 years ago to help care for his aging mother. He was 64, rode a 1982 Honda Goldwing, and had a notarized statement about the February title transfer sitting in a folder in his filing cabinet because Dex had asked him to keep a copy and Ray had never once failed to do what Dex asked. Soot, Bernard Garza, was in Bisbee, Arizona. 70 years old. Retired from the copper mines. Rode a 1985 Kawasaki Vulcan 750, black and chrome. He had driven out to Arizona 4 years ago because he said he needed to see the desert before he was too old to appreciate the light, and he had never come back, and nobody blamed him. Dex needed both of them. In person, in Harrisonburg, with their sworn statements, filed before a judge within 72 hours. He looked at resurrection. The Shovelhead. His own bike, the one he had rebuilt from a basket case he'd hauled out of a barn in Luray in 1991, rebuilt over 2 winters and ridden for 30 years across 11 states. She had 63,000 miles on her and she was not young, but her engine was sound and her tires were good and she could do 600 miles in a day if Dex asked her to. He did the math. Harrisonburg to Knoxville, 280 miles south on 81. Pick up Ray and his statement. Then cut west on Interstate 40 across Tennessee, across Arkansas, into Oklahoma and Texas, to the New Mexico border and then south into Arizona to Bisbee. That leg, close to 1,000 miles. Then the return. Knoxville to Harrisonburg, 280 miles back north. 1,300 miles, round trip, with a man who had to be collected in the middle of it. 72 hours. On a 46-year-old motorcycle. Most people would have called it impossible. Dex Holloway walked to the corner of the garage, took his riding jacket off the hook, black leather, Iron Covenant patch on the back, the patch that looked like a closed fist holding a highway road, and he pulled it on. He topped off the oil. He checked the tire pressure. He strapped a single saddlebag to the frame and put inside it a change of clothes, his phone charger, the fireproof document folder with every piece of paper he owned relating to the Triumph Bonneville, and the tin cup of cold coffee, which he drank in 3 long swallows while standing over the open saddlebag. He kicked Resurrection to life at 5:19 in the morning. The engine caught on the second kick, settled into that deep potato idle that every shovelhead owner lives for, and the single garage bulb buzzed and swayed overhead. Corporal watched from the doorway, ears up, and didn't chase the bike because he was a smart dog and he knew what the jacket meant. The sky over Harrisonburg was the particular purple-gray of a September dawn, the kind that doesn't ask permission before it opens into something enormous. Dex pulled out of the garage and turned south on Route 42, and the Shenandoah Valley spread out on both sides of him like something that had been waiting. He hit Interstate 81 south at 5:31 in the morning. The mountains were still dark on the right, the fog sitting in the valley like something left over from a dream. The highway was nearly empty, a few semis riding the right lane, their amber running lights strung out ahead like low planets. Dex settled Resurrection into the left lane at a steady 70, and the miles began to come. 15. 20. 30. The sky went from purple to a thin, watered-down rose, and the fog started to lift off the valley floor, and the Blue Ridge appeared behind him, enormous and permanent and completely indifferent to the situation. He thought about Gerald. He let himself do it, let the memory come in the way memories do on a motorcycle, loose and unguarded, because there is nowhere to put a thought except into the open air and it passes through you more cleanly that way. Gerald Breed had been a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a laugh that came from somewhere structural, like it was part of the building rather than the person. He had served in Korea, a decade before Dex was born, and he had come home with a stillness that the younger man recognized, not peace, but something that had made a decision. Gerald had never once pitted Dex's Vietnam years. He had never once treated him as broken. He had handed him tools and expected him to use them, and that had been its own form of healing that no doctor had ever managed. The Triumph Bonneville had been Gerald's pride in the way that specific, beautiful, irreplaceable things become part of a man's identity. A 1969 T120, red as a fresh wound, with original chrome that Gerald polished every Sunday morning the way other men went to church. He had ridden it through 4 decades and across 23 states and had rebuilt the engine himself twice. When he gave it to Dex, his hands had been shaking, not from the cancer, which hadn't taken his hands yet, but from the weight of the giving. Dex had understood, even in that moment, that the gift was also a trust. He was not going to let Curtis Breed reduce it to a line item in an estate. Exit 225 came up, Staunton, and Dex checked his mirror and held his lane and kept south. The temperature had come up into the low 50s by the time he crossed the Tennessee state line 2 hours later, and the Holston River Valley opened up below him all green and silver in the morning light, and the smell of the air changed, less mountain granite, more river mud and wood smoke, and Dex leaned into the descent and let Resurrection carry them down. He reached Ray Tipton's house in Knoxville at 8:53 in the morning. The house was a small brick ranch on a dead-end street off Chapman Highway, with a carport where the Gold Wing sat covered in a tan canvas tarp. There was a ceramic rooster by the front door that Ray's mother had put there and that Ray kept because it was hers. Dex pulled up on the gravel drive and killed the engine and didn't have to wait more than 30 seconds. The front door opened and Ray Tipton came out in his socks, holding a coffee mug, and stopped at the edge of the porch with his eyebrows up. He was a tall man, raw-boned, with a gray ponytail and a hearing aid in his left ear that he had worn for years and resented for the same number of years. He looked at Dex, looked at the road behind him, and his face did the calculation quickly. The letter came. He wasn't asking. Dex swung off the bike. His knees were stiff from 3 hours on the highway and he didn't hide it, just worked the stiffness out as he walked toward the porch. Charges dropped. Gerald's bike goes to Curtis unless we file by Thursday morning. I need you and the statement, Ray. In person. Harrisonburg. Ray Tipton looked into his coffee mug for a moment. Then he looked back up. When do we leave? There was the old gold wing to consider. The wing couldn't do 1,000 miles to Arizona and back in the time they had, not with Ray's mother's health what it was, not with anything being what it was. But there was a more immediate problem. Before Dex could get to Soot, before he could close the loop and bring both witnesses back to Harrisonburg in time, he needed Soot's sworn statement. Notarized. Physically in hand. Because the Arizona man didn't travel anymore, hadn't ridden farther than Tucson in 2 years, a fact Dex had learned from a brief and uncharacteristically short phone call last March. Ray made 3 phone calls while Dex drank a cup of coffee at his kitchen table and listened to the house. There was a television on low in the back bedroom. Ray's mother, Eloise, 91 years old and hard of hearing but sharp behind the eyes. Ray had introduced Dex to her once, and she had looked at the Iron Covenant patch for a long moment and then said, "You boys ride careful," in a tone that meant she had already said a prayer and the riding was up to them. Ray came back to the kitchen with his folder of documents, the notarized statement, a copy of the original title transfer, and his own handwritten account of that February Sunday in Gerald's garage, written out in the looping cursive that Ray used for everything important. He slid the folder across the table. "Soot won't come." Ray said it quietly, without judgment. "I called him. He's got his back again, the disc. He's not riding anywhere." Dex nodded. He had expected it. But he has a notary in Bisbee. A woman he trusts. He'll have the statement ready and signed and sealed if you go get it. How far is Bisbee from Tucson? 24 miles off I-10. Dex looked at the map on his phone and did the miles again. Harrisonburg to Knoxville, done. Knoxville to Bisbee, 940 miles along I-40 and I-10. Then Bisbee back to Harrisonburg, 1,930 miles if he rode straight. He had 54 hours left. He stood up, rolled his neck until it cracked, and picked up the document folder. Ray drove him to a gas station 2 miles away, where Dex filled Resurrection's tank and bought a bottle of water and a cellophane-wrapped biscuit that tasted approximately as described. Ray stood beside the pump with his arms crossed and said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. "You know what Gerald always said about you?" It wasn't a question. Dex capped the tank. "He said you were the only man he'd ever met who was more stubborn than a seized valve." He was wrong about that. Dex swung onto the bike. "You're stubborn as 2 seized valves." Something shifted in Ray's face, not quite a smile, but the shape a smile makes when the grief underneath is still too close. He put his hand on Dex's shoulder, brief and firm. "I'll be in Harrisonburg Thursday morning, 6 a.m. You bring Soot's statement." Dex pulled out of the gas station at 10:17 in the morning and turned west on I-40. Tennessee opened up wide and golden. The highway cut through the Cumberland Plateau, through gorges where the limestone walls rose sheer and wide on both sides and the smell of the creek bottoms came up cold and mineral. Fall was coming but hadn't fully committed yet. The trees were still mostly green, but here and there a red maple had gone ahead and done it alone, burning like something with a point to prove. Dex rode through it all, Resurrection's engine pulling steady and clean, the RPM sitting right at 3,600, the way she liked. He stopped for gas outside Nashville. Then outside Memphis. Then just across the Arkansas state line, at a truck stop on I-40 near a town called Hazen, where the land had gone flat and wide and the sky was fully enormous in every direction, and a woman inside the truck stop was playing a Dolly Parton cassette on a portable player behind the counter, and the coffee was bad but hot, and Dex drank 2 cups standing at the counter because his body was reminding him that 61-year-old spines have opinions about 6 consecutive hours on a motorcycle. He called Soot from the parking lot. Soot's voice was low and graveled, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years underground in copper dust. He had 3 sentences for most situations, and today was no different. Statements done. Notarized this morning. Martha's holding it. Martha Kellogg. Dex wrote the address on his left forearm with a gas station pen. A street in Bisbee near the old Copper Queen Mine District. He rode through Arkansas in the last light, the land stretching out on either side in those long cotton fields that had gone brown-silver for the season, irrigation rigs standing idle against the sky. Crossed into Oklahoma after dark. The wind off the high plains hit him at the state line like a conversation he hadn't started, pushing at his jacket, working at the edges, and Dex tucked lower on the bars and let resurrection push through it. Oklahoma City went by as a glow on the right horizon, a smear of orange above the dark plain, and then it was gone and the road went dark again and the mile markers came and went like slow heartbeats. He stopped for the night at a roadside motel in Shamrock, Texas, at the kind of place where the ice machine works and nothing else does, and the desk clerk didn't ask questions because he had the face of a man who had already answered them all. Room 7. A queen bed with a bedspread the color of old mustard. He set the document folder on the nightstand, where he could see it, and he was asleep before the television warmed up. He dreamed about Gerald's garage. The way it smelled on Sunday mornings, 2-stroke oil and newsprint, and the particular sweetness of a wood fire someone nearby was burning for warmth. The Triumph Bonneville sitting in the center of the floor with the morning light on its tank, red and deep. Gerald's voice, not saying anything specific, just present, the way a voice is present in a dream. Dex woke at 4 in the morning, which was when he always woke, and lay in the dark with the dream still in the room. Something about the civil ruling had been chewing at him for the entire ride, something underneath the obvious unfairness that he hadn't quite gotten a clear look at yet. Curtis Breed's paperwork, the forged or altered title, however it had been constructed, had been good enough to convince a county judge. A private attorney, Paulette had told him, could challenge the notarization, could argue the timeline. But there was something else. There had been something Gerald had said, in one of his last conversations, something about the Triumph and Curtis and a decision Gerald had made years earlier that he hadn't explained fully. Dex sat up in bed and opened the document folder. He had read the contents of that folder 40 times in 11 months. The original title. The notarized bill of sale. Ray's statement. His own written account. Paulette's notes from the arraignment. The county court's civil decision, received by email and printed on his garage printer, ink slightly pale on the left margin. And then, at the back of the folder, a thing he had put there 6 months ago and then, in the grinding weight of the legal process, had half forgotten. A letter. Gerald had written it 3 weeks before he died. He had mailed it to Dex with a note on the outside of the envelope that said, "Read this only if you ever need to use it." In the whole 11 months of the legal fight, Dex had kept it in the folder but had not opened it, because opening it had felt, and he knew this was irrational, knew it the way you know something in the pre-dawn dark of a motel room, like using up the last of something he wasn't ready to be without. He looked at the envelope now. Gerald's handwriting. Blue ballpoint, the looping capitals of a man who had gone to school in an era when penmanship was a grade. Dexter. In case you need it. 3 weeks before he died. There was light coming under the door from the parking lot. The ice machine 3 rooms down made a sound like something settling. Dex picked up the envelope, pressed it flat with his palm, held it there for a moment. Then he opened it. The letter was 3 pages, dense and careful, written in Gerald's looping hand. Dex read it slowly, once. Then again, this time with his breath held. What Gerald had written, in the patient and precise way that dying men write what matters, was the full story, a story Dex had known in pieces but had never seen laid out in sequence. Years earlier, Curtis Breed had borrowed money from his father. Borrowed it repeatedly. The last amount was $14,000, taken over 18 months in payments, ostensibly to settle a debt in Roanoke. Gerald had never seen the money again, and more than that, had never seen Curtis make any genuine attempt to return it. In the last year of Gerald's life, Curtis had come to him once, not to sit with his father, not to help with the medical appointments, but to ask about the estate. Specifically about the Triumph Bonneville, which Curtis had apparently been told, by someone Dex couldn't identify, was worth considerably more than the sentimental value Gerald placed on it. A 1969 Triumph Bonneville T120 in running, original condition was worth, as of the previous year's auction records, between $18,000 and $25,000. Gerald had found out about Curtis's interest and had acted immediately. He had transferred the title to Dex not only because he wanted the bike ridden, but because he knew, had known clearly, the way dying men know the shape of the water they're leaving, that Curtis would come for it. But there was more. In the last paragraph of the letter, Gerald had written something that Dex read a third time before he fully absorbed it. The notary who had signed the original bill of sale in February, a woman named Helen Krause, who worked out of a small office on South Main Street in Harrisonburg, had been present that February Sunday not by chance. Gerald had called her specifically, 2 days before, and had told her that he anticipated the transfer might be contested. She had kept a copy of the notarized document in her own files, along with a brief notation in her register that recorded the names of both witnesses present, Ray Tipton and Bernard Garza, and a physical description of the transaction. Helen Krause's copy. Sitting in an office on South Main Street in Harrisonburg. 11 months, Dex thought. 11 months of fighting with a folder full of documents, and there had been a third copy the entire time, with a note in a notary's register that described exactly what happened and who was there. He sat on the edge of the motel bed in Shamrock, Texas, with Gerald's letter in his hands, and for the first time in 11 months, something behind his sternum loosened. He drove his thumb across the bridge of his nose. His eyes were not wet. He was simply tired, and the light was still low, and the room was very quiet. He called Paulette at 5:48 in the morning. She answered on the third ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she was the kind of attorney who should have had more resources than she did. He told her about Helen Krause. He heard her writing. She told him she would drive to the office on South Main Street that morning and verify the register entry. She told him that if the entry was what Gerald's letter described, it could constitute grounds to reopen the civil case. She told him she couldn't promise anything, but her voice had a quality to it that it hadn't had in the previous 11 months. He read her the relevant paragraphs of Gerald's letter and she asked him to photograph every page and send them immediately. He did. Standing in the parking lot of the Shamrock Motel in the early dark, the high plains wind pressing cold against his face, he photographed each page of Gerald's handwriting against the yellow glow of his phone. He got back on Resurrection at 6:14 in the morning. Texas went on for a very long time, the way Texas always does, not as a complaint but as a simple fact of geography that the road presents without apology. The staked plains went by flat and enormous, the pale grass and red dirt and sky the color of a blank page, and the semis running west were spread out so far apart you could see 3 or 4 of them ahead and behind like a slow convoy. Amarillo was a collection of signs and water towers and an overpass, and then it was gone. The Canadian River Canyon opened up sudden and deep on the right, the walls striped red and cream, and Dex leaned over the guardrail for a moment at the overlook and watched the river at the bottom, thin and silver and entirely unbothered. His phone buzzed on the tank bag mount. A message from Paulette. Helen Krause's office confirmed. Register entry intact. Both names. Date matches. Filing motion to stay the civil judgment this afternoon. He read it twice on the overlook with the canyon behind him. Then he put the phone back and got back on the bike. New Mexico came over the horizon with that particular quality of light that doesn't exist anywhere else, a clarity that feels almost aggressive, like the air has been stripped of everything unnecessary, and what's left is just photons and distance. Tucumcari went by. Santa Rosa. He stopped for gas in Albuquerque, where the mountains rose behind the city in long volcanic ridges, and ate a green chili breakfast burrito from a roadside window that cost $3 and was the best thing he had eaten in 2 days. He was tired now. The real kind, the kind that sits in the lower back and spreads. He had been on the road for 31 hours with one night's sleep in the middle. His hands on the grips had gone from tense to loose to a practiced neutral that came from decades of long miles. Resurrection was running fine. She had burned a little more oil than usual coming through the flat stretch of Oklahoma, which he had topped off in Shamrock, but the engine note was steady and the temperature was good. He crossed into Arizona at the little port of entry on I-10, waved through by a border patrol agent who gave the Shovelhead a long and respectful look, and turned south toward the mountains. The Mule Mountains came up out of the desert floor like something that had grown deliberately, with purpose, their ridgelines sharp and dark against the blue October sky. The road climbed through the Mule Pass Tunnel, old masonry, 1950s work, the kind of infrastructure that was built to last because the people building it weren't in a hurry to be replaced, and came out the other side into Bisbee, and Dex had to stop for a moment on the far side of the tunnel just to look at it. The town clung to the hillsides in that steep, improbable way that mining towns do. The Victorian houses stacked up the slopes in colors that had faded beautifully, the copper and umber of the hillside bleeding into the painted boards of the storefronts below. It smelled of high desert and old stone and a faint sulfur trace that was the ghost of a century of mining. Martha Kaloja's office was on Brewery Avenue, down near the old Copper Queen. Dex found it without much trouble, a small storefront with a notary's seal in the window and a hand-lettered sign that said business hours in permanent marker. The door was unlocked. Martha Kaloja was perhaps 70, with white hair cut short and reading glasses she wore on a chain, and she handed Dex the envelope with Soot's notarized statement before he had fully introduced himself. "Bernard said you'd look like you hadn't slept." She appraised him. He was generous. Dex almost smiled. She offered him water and he accepted. She offered him a chair and he accepted that too, because his back had decided it was done accepting anything less. He sat for 15 minutes in her small clean office with the notary seal and the framed pictures of Bisbee passed on the walls, old black and white photographs of the open-pit mine, of Main Street in 1912 when the copper was running and the town was flush, of men in canvas clothes standing on slopes of broken rock with their picks and their extraordinary ordinary faces. Men who had come from Sonora and Galicia and County Cork and all of them standing on the same hill. He thought, Gerald would have liked this office. He called Soot before he left. Soot's voice came through low and familiar, and there was a silence at the start of the call that contained more than most conversations. "You got it. Got it." Dex held the envelope up as if Soot could see it. "How's the back?" "Older." "You're going to make it?" "Resurrection's going to make it. I'm just the ballast." Soot made a sound that was his version of laughter. Then, before he hung up, Dex. "He knew you were the right man. For the bike. For all of it. He knew it before he knew he was sick." Dex stood on Brewery Avenue in Bisbee, Arizona, with the envelope in his hand and the mountains above him and the old town falling away down the hillside below, and he said, "I know." He left Bisbee at 3 in the afternoon, turned north on Arizona 80, and came back to I-10 heading east with the sun beginning its descent behind him. The return was harder. That is the truth of long roads, the going out is fueled by urgency, and the coming back is fueled only by the decision to come back, which is a quieter engine. His body had been in the saddle for the better part of 2 days. The miles through Arizona gave way to New Mexico in the copper light, and the Lordsburg Flats went by and the Rio Grande Valley came up in the distance, pale and winding, and the light went gold and then red and then the dark came down and the stars over New Mexico were preposterous, the full catalog, edge to edge, no competition from any city for 200 miles in any direction. He stopped in Las Cruces for gas and a meal that was hot and had protein in it, which were the only 2 requirements he had, and he sat in a booth by the window and looked at his phone and let himself be still for 20 minutes. Paulette had sent 2 messages. The first, motion to stay filed. Judge reviewing. The second, 40 minutes later, stay granted. Civil judgment suspended pending new hearing. Helen Cross subpoenaed. Hearing set Friday morning, 9 a.m. Friday. He had until Thursday at 6 a.m. to be in Harrisonburg. He did the math. Las Cruces to Harrisonburg, 1,700 miles. 34 hours on the road. He had 38. He could do it. He paid for the meal and walked out to Resurrection and stood beside her in the parking lot of a New Mexico diner at 10 o'clock at night, with the stars above and the desert dark all around and Interstate 10 running east in both directions, and he put his hand flat on the gas tank the way he had on the morning this had started, the morning the envelope came. The tank was warm from the engine. He said, quietly, to no one, "We're going home." He kicked Resurrection to life and turned east. Texas in the dark is its own country. The mile markers on I-10 are the slowest he has ever known any mile markers to be, each one earns its number, and the distances between cities are honest and enormous. He was in El Paso at 10:30. Fort Stockton at 2 in the morning, the air gone cold and the hills invisible on both sides, only the road's white line and the reflector posts coming at him out of the dark and the old Shovelhead's headlight making its small yellow world ahead. He stopped in Fort Stockton for coffee from a vending machine that was exactly as bad as expected and walked around the parking lot for 5 minutes in the cold air because his legs needed to remember they were legs and not just accessories to a motorcycle seat. A trucker coming out of the truck stop looked at the Shovelhead and said, "That a 78?" and Dex said, "Yes." The trucker nodded with the nod of someone who knows exactly what it takes to keep a machine that old on the road, and nothing more needed to be said. Back on the highway. San Antonio came up enormous in the night, its lights filling a whole sector of the horizon, and then the freeway exchanges opened into a maze that Dex rode by feel and posted signs, and then the city was behind him and the hill country spread out in the dark to the north, juniper-scented and rocky, and the road curved east and he kept pushing. He crossed into Louisiana before dawn and stopped at the state line rest area, where the live oaks were hung with Spanish moss that barely moved in the still air, and he walked to the edge of the rest area and back twice, and drank the last of the water from his saddlebag, and checked the oil again. Clean. The engine was running like it had been freshly rebuilt. Like it knew. He thought about that February Sunday again. Gerald's garage. The smell of the wood fire nearby. The Triumph Bonneville in the center of the floor, red and deep, with the morning light finding the chrome. Gerald's hands, shaking not from weakness but from the weight of the giving. And Dex's own hands taking the title, feeling the paper, feeling the full gravity of what it meant to receive something irreplaceable from the man who had called him brother on a rainy night on Interstate 81 47 years ago. He had thought, in the worst months of the legal fight, that he might lose not only the bike but the meaning of those 47 years, that the legal machinery, with its paperwork and its doubts, could somehow retroactively undo the truth.